Welcome, everyone, to the Civic Trust Podcast. I'm Matt Harder, your host and founder of Civic Trust, and I'm joined by Alexander Lipka, our brave, fearless marketing coordinator. How you doing, Alex?
I'm quite well. Thank you for having me, Matt. I'm happy to be here. I guess the big question I had, the editor as well as marketing coordinator, if people don't know, but I was really excited to I don't know, hear what this episode was really about from your perspective.
Well, so we interview Holly Russon Gilman. Let me give you a quick bio of Holly. Holly's a leading voice in democratic innovation with experience at the White House and academia and working directly with cities across the country to reimagine civic participation. Her work has shaped how many of us think about participatory democracy today, and I had a great time speaking with her. Right. So Holly she's a great guest. She just has a tremendous amount of experience, which I think you were able to check out in terms of just exposure to different models. And so, yeah, I had a great time speaking with her.
Yeah, I mean, just the fact that she's worked within such huge spaces like the White House and everything like that, it's so cool to see all of these aspects of PB, all these people working on PB that, I'd never really see. Even being a contractor to this project, these aren't names I know, and I'm really happy to start knowing them. Why specifically?
Hopefully we can bring more of them on.
Yeah, no, I'm really hoping so. I think we can. Why specifically did you choose Holly for the first interview you did for the Civic Trust Podcast?
Yeah, so for those following the podcast, the first interview is just with you and I. We talk about Civic Trust and the history of Civic Trust. And the reason I chose Holly for my first interview was that Holly was the one that introduced me to PB. Back in New York in 2015 or so, I was studying civic tech, trying to get into the field, and I met her at an event. And she was working at Columbia. She had just written a book on PB. So I read the book, met her when she was speaking, and I had read it, so I knew what to ask her about. And she immediately introduced me to some really key people. And we kept that relationship the whole time I was in New York, and she would answer questions for me. It's not easy to figure out the civic engagement field when you're new. There's kind of like things that people do, things that people kind of say they want to do, but I don't know. It's like a little bit opaque at the beginning, and so she was able to do a lot of explaining for me, and was just a great guide. So I owe a lot to Holly. I was glad to have her on.
Yeah, I can tell. I mean, the opaqueness is definitely something I feel as somebody new to this space as of a year ago, maybe. There's so much gray area, so much that you would think would be obvious, but it's quite not. Part of the reason I'm really happy that we're doing this podcast, even for me, I get to learn something new every day sitting down editing these interviews. With on that point, things I learned, like you just said, the origin of Civic Trust. We did that interview where we talked about where Civic Trust came from and everything like that, but now I know where even before, this is a real origin story. And Holly's reaction when you told her about how her book led you to this, and she was really the one to start you up. That was really sweet to hear. And like I said before, it's so wonderful just to see all of these amazing people working in civic tech and participatory budgeting, policy, everything like that, where their names need to be broadcasted. This is something that I wish I knew before, and I'm just happy to know now.
Yeah, that's funny that you mentioned that. I think she might have forgotten that, because I reminded her, I was like, hey, your book got me into this whole thing. I got this whole thing started 7 years ago, and I think she was like, wow, that's pretty cool.
I know, yeah, it was such a real, genuine reaction. It was beautiful.
Yeah. Well, so let's see. Anything else before we start?
Yeah, I had a question.
You want to talk about?
Just before we dive into all of this, what's new at Civic Trust? I mean, we know how it started, but where are we at now?
We're still working with a couple clients. We have Denver just launched their idea collection, and it's going to be going until April. So if you live in Denver, you can go to pbdenver.com. You could submit an idea for the $2 million PB that we're going to be doing throughout all of 2026. And then we're midway through one in Kennett Square, Pennsylvania. And so we're getting ready to do the vote in the spring. And so if you live out in Kennett Square, look out for that one. And we're also talking about another exciting project that we might be announcing as soon as the next podcast. And so that's what we're up to.
Cool. I'm wicked excited to see where this goes and how we can portray it. My actual last question is what should listeners be paying attention to in the next 40 minutes or so?
Well, I think one of the things I loved most about this podcast, and that I think listeners will also enjoy, is that it's not easy to know all the different things that are happening in civic engagement. And Holly is somebody who does understand that. And this is what we're trying to do at Civic Trust, is like push this entire field forward. Now we focus specifically on participatory budgeting on PB, but there's a lot of exciting stuff happening. And so, after doing this, I just wanted to have Holly back on to understand more of what she sees from her vantage point. But I would say if you're a listener, yeah, check that out. Like, listen to all the different things that she's referencing, the projects in different cities. That's what I find to be pretty exciting. And we'll hopefully get her back on to get more of that information.
Hopefully. Yeah, I mean, I'm excited to do my third listen back, so say we dive into it.
All right, let's do it. Thanks, Alex.
Thank you.
All right, guys, enjoy. All right, I'm here with Holly Russon Gilman. Holly, what is the most exciting thing happening in civic engagement right now, and why?
Well, thank you so much, Matt, for having me. It is an honor to be here. There are a lot of exciting things that are happening right now in civic engagement. Some people have said that the deliberative wave is coming from Europe over here to the United States. There's a lot of energy and excitement for thinking about new models, whether it's Bowling Green, Kentucky, a jigsaw pilot using Polis, an AI-enabled discussion platform to allow residents to submit ideas online about long-term city planning goals. It allowed more than 7,500 people to participate. We're also seeing a wave of citizen assemblies springing up around the country. And we're also seeing investment and recognition in the need for local engagement. I'm thinking of funder collaboratives such as the Trust for Civic Life, investing in nonpartisan civic life around the country, and other pushes to really recognize local level civic life in the country.
That was a treasure trove of information right there. I love it. That's why we have you on our very first interview here with the Civic Trust Podcast. You just gave us like a week worth of stuff to research and to get to know the field better. So thank you for that. And Polis is fantastic. I love their platform, and I love that they're still doing stuff and it's expanding. Side note, what do you think about this idea that Europe is kind of more on the forefront of this kind of thing compared to the United States?
It's a great question. Well, again, I'm honored to be here, Matt. I'm a huge fan of yours and all the work that you are doing. I think that, we in the United States, especially in the last 10 years, there's been a recognition that the status quo is untenable. And so I am seeing more and more demand signals, people inside government, across civil society, finding more models for what I call collaborative governance, or building hooks and levers between residents and decision making. And as you know, when you see, the origins of participatory budgeting starting in Porto Alegre and coming up, I think that we now have a sense in the United States that we need to innovate on democracy. So I think we should pull best practices and ideas from wherever they are. And when you look at a practice like citizen assemblies, they are more institutionalized across the pond and in Europe. And so I think we should leverage, we should learn what works. And then we have to be really sensitive to the local, very unique geopolitical, hyper-contextualized context of the United States, which it's a huge country. It's very geographically spread out. The topography is very different. So again, not one size fits all will work in any of these communities. So it's about lessons from places wherever they're great lessons, and then really thinking about how do you contextualize them to fit in a very specific context in a U.S. locality.
I love that. And I love that you talk about democratic innovations. That's a paradigm that not a lot of people are into, but that's one of America's greatest value adds to the world, right? Like gifts to the world, is that we have been the seat of so much innovation in the past. And so why not innovate on these types of processes? So we're going to be focusing mostly on participatory budgeting for this podcast, which we'll call PB from here on out. Can you describe for me what makes it a genuinely different model of engagement compared to other approaches?
Absolutely. Well, with participatory budgeting, typically city officials set aside a part of the annual budget and work with residents to decide how to spend it. The process typically includes people who may be left out of traditional democratic processes, young people, non-citizens, people who are formerly incarcerated. Residents can send in ideas for projects, and then volunteer delegates work with elected officials to create proposals, and then residents vote on these projects, and the winner is funded by the city. One of the things that makes PB unique is that it really enables genuine decision making, civic agency, and power to constituents. They're not in a consultative or advisory role. They are making binding decisions over funding. It creates opportunities for residents to talk to each other, hear new points. People meet their neighbors. There's a real de-siloing feature to PB, and it gives constituents real power in governing. And there is, when done well, I think the process is institutionalized. So there's a sense of this is how we make decisions, and there's an annual cycle, and it's transparent. And there are clear rules of the road and norms. So it's not a one-off ad hoc engagement, but ideally it becomes an institutionalized way for people to have a more authentic, deeper, rich democracy experience than just voting every 2 to 4 years, which is a shallow form of democracy.
Absolutely. I love that term, de-siloing. I hadn't heard that before, but I kept thinking about how as we do this, that's what we're doing, right? Is we encounter silos, and then we're constantly kind of penetrating through them and having people, transcend those previous barriers. Okay, I want to quickly let the audience know about how I met you. And so I was at an event in New York City, and I had read your book, Democracy Reinvented, Participatory Budgeting, and Civic Innovation in America. And I didn't know you were going to speak. It was in the middle of the day. It was like hosted by MasterCard or something. A buddy in finance brought me, and he was just like, oh, I think you'll like this. It has something to do with civics. And there you were speaking. And I was really overjoyed because I had just finished your book, and that is what introduced me to participatory budgeting. And so I was just like, oh my gosh, because I had a Google alert out for democratic innovations, and that came in. And so I was like, I'm buying the book. I bought it. I was totally sold on PB. And so I met you that day and told you how I felt about the book. And then you actually introduced me to some people from Civic Hall. And that led to me getting hired to do PB for the New York City Council. And so that one, reading your book and then that chance meeting with you is what got me into this business. And Civic Trust wouldn't be around if it hadn't been for your book and for that choice meeting, And so that was just amazing. So your book has influenced a lot of people in the space. I was actually just meeting with Pete Peterson, the Dean of Public Policy at Pepperdine, a month ago, and your book was in his office. And I asked him about it, and I was like, oh, what do you think of this book? And he was just like, I taught a course on that book. And I was like, oh my gosh, Holly's a friend. That's amazing. So why did you choose with that book and with so much of your subsequent material to zero in on participatory budgeting in your work?
Well, Matt, thank you. That is so generous. That is really a very heartwarming story. And you've been such an inspiration to me. And I'm so glad that you're doing this work out there. And that is just really kind of you. Thank you. I think when you write a book, you can only hope to have a success story like this. So thank you. It's interesting, with the book, I first met Alderman Joe Moore when I was a grad student at Harvard over a dinner at the Ash Center, and I had done my undergraduate degree in Chicago. And so, I met him, and I was really struck at the idea that Chicago, when you think of, the Windy City, quote unquote, could be a hotbed of democratic innovation. And I was very fortunate at the time to be working really closely with Archon Fung and to be at the Ash Center. And so I was studying a lot of these democratic innovations and taking classes from faculty from all over the world, many of whom had actually implemented these innovations. And I was working on a project called participedia.net, which is a repository of deliberative innovations around the world. And I had been a part of one of the last America Speaks dialogues. It was called Our Budget, Our Economy, and I helped oversee research around 19 locations to really think about people come together and deliberate over concrete policy decisions, what that does attitudinally to shape how they engage in democracy, how they view their life in a society. So I was sort of studying this stuff and sort of primed on this stuff. My first job out of college, I was a grassroots organizer in rural New Hampshire, and the power of people coming together, going door to door, trying to build something. I mean, for me, that is sort of the democratic ideal. My senior thesis in college was on the Iowa caucus and the idea of the polis in Hannah Arendt's literature. So, for a long time, I was sort of really chewing on the concept of what does civic life look like? How do people come together? How do you make it powerful? What are the roles of digital tools? That was something I was thinking a lot about in my work. And so when participatory budgeting started in the United States, I was very excited to follow the work in Chicago. And then I'm from New York, and the process, really exploded in that first year. In 2011, 4 city council members came together to really launch PBNYC, and it was an amazing group with Community Voices Heard, the Participatory Budgeting Project, a whole group of grassroots leaders, coalitions, amazing steering committee, and it was really just, I feel very lucky, like an opportunity of a lifetime to really get to do in-depth research on that for almost a year, and to be traveling, all the boroughs all the time. People were so generous. I remember maybe it was 14 years ago this time where I was shadowing a budget delegate committee during the holidays on Christmas Eve, going to visit sites to make sure that they were coming up with proposals that were equitable and really inclusive of the community. So it was just so inspiring, and to see it happen sort of in my hometown, and to be given the freedom, and just I'm so grateful to my whole dissertation committee and all the faculty. I did my PhD in the government department at Harvard, who were really supportive of trying to really explore something new, because that was the genesis of the book. It stemmed from my dissertation, and it was really about how do you make sense of the theory behind democratic innovation, and then how do you try to understand it in real time with an innovation taking place in the present.
I love that. You're such an OG working on participedia.net and stuff like that. I love thinking about that. And that this came.
Thank you. It's still a great resource.
Yeah, no, it is. I just like that. It takes me back thinking about all those things, like Community Voices Heard. I hadn't heard those guys since I was doing PB in New York in 16, 17. So it's just like, I love all those references, and that your work in PB is like an outgrowth of all that different exploration, right? And it's kind of the praxis of all these different things put together, right? In a way, it can be a blessing and a curse, I think, that PB is able to encapsulate so many different innovations, because it's easy to almost confuse it, when you're talking to people, especially when you're pitching it to people. It's like, it does all these things, but that's what makes it rich. How did you first become, well, I guess you answered the question, how you first became interested in PB and democratic innovations more broadly, or do you have a separate answer for that?
No, I think that was sort of the answer.
Okay, yeah. Well, can you tell me, zero in on a particular moment when PB clicked for you and you realized it really works?
Absolutely. I mean, I remember being in many a community center basement and just seeing people, coming together evenings in the cold and really hashing it out. I think that was where a lot of I love what you said about praxis, like this idea that has stuck with me, that the best way to engage people is to enable them to collaboratively problem solve. Like that moment in PB where people, I'm thinking here on the delegate side, where they are rolling up their sleeves and they are trying to really understand how the sausage is made, what the trade-offs are. Oh, okay, well that funding is actually federal. Well, that's state. Okay, well if we did this, like there'll be problems here. And they're actually trying to weigh trade-offs and collaborative problem solve. Like so much of the last 10 years of my work has been informed by the firsthand account of witnessing people really having to think through the trade-offs and what I would call hands-on civics in action. It's much more powerful than when you're learning it in a textbook. It's real life, and it's fun, it's messy, it's hard, it's exciting. You see the role of skilled facilitators, why that really matters for addressing power inequities and power imbalances. And that's the really fun, messy, hard, joyous, creative stuff.
Yeah. It's interesting to hear you talk about the budget delegate process, and this time when people are coming together to make these trade-offs and learn about that. It makes me think about my time in New York doing PBs there, because my second cycle, I actually volunteered to help run one of the local budget delegate groups for Parks and Environment at Park Slope.
That's awesome.
And so, yeah, just like you said, we were there at night in the cold, in the fall, everybody together. But hearing you talk about that and thinking about how many people that touched, because at the time they were running it in 35 different districts. And in our district, we were in Brad Landers, if you remember. He was kind of an all-star. There were several really proficient districts, and his was one of them. Shout out Brad Lander. And that one, he had 3 different committees running in just that one district. And you had 35 districts, and each of those was maybe a dozen people or something. So you think about how many lives that touched. Yeah. And how much hands-on civics got done through that process as just I don't want to say a minor part of the PB, but as just kind of one aspect of a much broader umbrella.
Yeah. I love that. I also think when you then pair that, Matt, with the vote and making a vote that's really joyous and really centered around creativity and expression and celebration, and also, when you look at a PB vote that reduces barriers to entry, so if you have online opportunities, you have multi-day opportunities, you're meeting people where they're at, because I think what you're almost describing, Matt, with the budget delegate process is you're setting into motion an engine, and it creates all this positive momentum so that when people then you open the aperture to vote, people are saying, wow, my community members, they showed up, right? They came, they did this thing in the cold. Let's celebrate that too. And I think it adds to the momentum around the vote. And when you contrast it with how restrictive voting is in the US, sort of very time-bound, not holiday, you see the trade-offs. I think PB in so many ways can widen the aperture of how we imagine democracy, whether it's residents as co-producers on the delegate side, or, engaging people who, reducing the barriers to entry for traditionally underserved or young people, and then also making the vote more of a celebration, more of a party and an atmosphere where people are coming together. And I think, even the last year or so, all the literature on isolation, people want to be together. And so if there's a way that you can be together and it improves your community, that sounds amazing.
Yeah. And for what better purpose to be together than to be improving the city where you live, right? And I have a question about that in a little bit. And I completely agree. What do you think is the single biggest misunderstanding about PB today?
Oh, that's a good question. Well, I think that, if people feel like it's a check the box exercise, that is that is sort of a big misunderstanding. I also think when I think of that flywheel that the budget delegates can put into motion, it's more, in a way, PB is more than the sum of its parts, because you have all these positive externalities of all the people who are touched and all of the relationships that are created. There are people coming together who are meeting their neighbors for the first time. They're changing their relationships with their elected officials. And then they're also changing the way that decisions get made inside of government. And it's hard, I think, from an external perspective to see all 3 of those things happening. And that's what I try to get at in part of the book, that you're changing the relational dynamic one-on-one with individuals. You're changing that relationship between individuals and their representatives, their electeds, their people in government. And then you're also changing the way that city government can run. And you're doing all 3 of those, but some of them, they're on different time lags. Some of them happen more quickly than others. And some of them are more obvious and transparent than others.
Yeah, I like that you call it a check the box exercise. Like it's not a check the box exercise.
It's not a check the box
exactly.
exercise.
And
yes,
I like that you use that term because that feeds into some stuff that we're about to talk about.
Oh,
Actually,
okay.
that bridges perfectly into my next question, which is one of the other big influences you had on me was when you and I were having a conversation in back when we both lived in New York. You know, we used to occasionally catch up on the phone, and I would ask you, you know, to tell me more about the field. And after I had been in civic engagement for a little while, it occurred to me I started to encounter this certain setting where it felt like the focus of the so-called public engagement was not really to learn from the public, but it was to create the appearance of learning from the public, right? And that's the check the box exercise, right? Where it's just sort of like, okay, we have to hear from people, so now we're all in a room at maybe a time that's not so convenient. And I was kind of looking at times like, what are they going to do with this feedback? Like, is it really something that is going to feel worthwhile for the participants to have given their time and energy to? And in that conversation, you recommended a book, Do It Yourself Democracy, The Rise of Public Engagement, the Public Engagement Industry by Carolyn Lee. You said that's a book that kind of talks about that. And I remember at the beginning of that book, it's been a few years, been 10 since I read it. But I remember still the opening scenario, it's like a post-Katrina, big engagement. And, she pretty much, from my memory, pulls no punches about saying, they spent all this money and put all of this effort into creating an extremely good visual environment, very diverse, very open-looking place where they're going to hear from the community. And they're going to take all that into consideration with the post-Katrina reconstruction. But then the crescendo of it is, it was impossible to find where any of that stuff went. And it just sort of disappeared after the in-person engagement. And that, for me, that story encapsulated, like, that's what I've been seeing. I've been seeing that sometimes decision makers have a demand for wanting to appear that they're listening to everybody. But then when it comes time to actually incorporate that stuff, they either maybe are not incorporating it fully, or they're not describing how they're doing it such that the participants can't tell that it was really worth their time. So I'm curious, as somebody with your vantage point who's able to follow so many different threads through civic engagement, is this something which is talked about openly? Is this something which is like of concern that there's that so often a civic engagement exercise can be a check the box exercise?
It's a great question. I think you really identified the decision-making point of, will there be something done with this feedback or not? And one of the things that I really encourage people to think about is, if you're going to do poorly managed engagement in levels of hyper mistrust, it can make the problem worse. So if you're going to engage residents in decision-making, there needs to be a clear understanding of what's in and what's out and what happens to that input. I would say that is different from saying that every single thing that residents come to have to then be put into policy. I think we need much more transparent feedback mechanisms and feedback loops to understand why something is then turned into a decision, why was it not, and feeling comfortable with that dialogue. And I understand the hesitation sometimes of opening the Pandora's box on engagement for fear that people will not be able to deliver. But over-promising and under-delivering, I think, is probably the scenario to avoid. So it's about, I think, right-sizing the engagement. So you're engaging people in a topic where they have a level of expertise, and you're able to channel that feedback into some kind of an outcome. And then you're able to do a feedback loop back, explaining, okay, here's what we did with your feedback. Here's what we were not able to do, and here's why. And really investing in that whole cycle is really critical to avoid this challenge arising.
Yes, I think that's a great point, the right sizing the engagement, right? And so you set the proper expectations. That seems very important, because in my experience, like you said, I do understand why people fear opening the Pandora's box, as you call it, but the communication is the solution to that? Because people are so reasonable in my experience. If you treat them like adults, if you're honest, if you're open, they will be reasonable. But it takes that kind of first step of involving them and then being clear and thinking it through. The more experience I get in PB, the more I realize how city governments are filled with both supporters and detractors. And I encounter some administrators who are totally in favor of this kind of deeper participation, but then others that kind of resist it. Is this your experience, and how do you view that kind of tension?
It's a good question. I think, sometimes there are things that can unite people in their support and concerns around a process, and that can be around some of the challenges. And what I have seen is some of the people who may be skeptical at first, once they run through a cycle or a pilot, they're able to see in real time things that can assuage some of those concerns. And I think, Matt, it also ties to what we were just talking about in terms of ensuring that you're able to launch pilots and do them well so that you can have some of those early wins and victories. I also think increasingly, in complex political environments, there needs to be a clear either, demand signal from the public or some kind of air cover internally so that people can justify how they're using taxpayer dollars to fund new forms of engagement. And I think that is something that we have to just be sensitive to ensure that people are able to get the air cover that they need, because some people, I think, would be more open to some of these processes, but feel like they will then have to go to their supervisor, who has to go to their supervisor. And so how do you create some sort of an incentive structure on the higher levels to ensure that there is alignment and almost de-risk some of these initiatives for people?
That's a great answer. I've never heard that before and thought about that. Can you give examples of what kind of air cover, like what that might look like?
Sure. Well, when you've seen sometimes like a Bloomberg Philanthropy come in and give cities awards or, elevate individual public servants, I think that's an example where you can sort of be spotlighting best cases, wins, sort of elevating some of the leaders who are trying innovative methods inside local government. So that is one opportunity. Yeah, more philanthropic, sort of catalytic funding to support pilots and experimentation and leveraging other actors. I'm thinking here of nonprofits, the role of academia, providing some support, I think can also help in that sort of air cover way so that, for example, if someone inside a local government says, well, I don't have the bandwidth, and we say, well, we're actually going to partner you with 2 graduate students who can add capacity and then write their master's thesis on the amazing work you're doing, that sort of is a different incentive structure, right? Than if we're saying, well, you have to do this all on your own. So it's sort of how do you create an ecosystemic approach so that you're able to lift up folks who maybe are curious about an innovation, but then have other sort of resource constraints or hesitations.
Yeah, I love that. I think, like you say, doing a pilot and then showing people that it works to kind of de-risk it and just be like, this is, because it's true. A lot of times, I think the first time I talk to cities about PB, oftentimes you can tell what's happening behind their eyes is this, the wheels they're turning are saying like, oh, they're going to ask for the craziest stuff. And then when we can't do it, they're going to get mad at us. And it's the opposite every time, right? It's just kind of like, look at the list of winners. There's so, when we did Denver's last year, we found that the 4 winning projects were almost directly linked to the mayoral priorities. They were like perfect representations of it. It's like, what better alignment can you have? And that was organic. It just so happened that what the public wanted and what the mayor saw as like positive moves for the city were in perfect alignment, And so it's like, you have to run the test. You have to show them that. In your experience, who inside government are natural allies and who are common detractors? And why do you think that might be, and how might we bring them along?
I think there is no right size, one size fits all model on this. So it's very hard to make generalizations. Sometimes I say, if you know one community, you know one community. So, I have seen people all across different departments. There are some localities that already have strong civic engagement, community outreach teams, individuals who have deep relationships with neighborhoods, local organizations, community leaders. So sometimes they can be natural allies if you see people who have that background. Sometimes they have community organizing. City managers, often I've seen people who are more forward, frontline facing, I think sometimes have a more inclination or a proclivity, a spidey sense of why this matters. So I've seen all sorts of folks who kind of understand that this can be an opportunity for reimagining that relationship, or sometimes it's about better allocating resources. Instead of bringing on a consultant to do X, what if we took those same resources and led a innovation process instead?
Despite all the things that we've said about PB being super, potentially transparent and definitely transformative, some of the risks of traditional engagement still exist within it. What do you think are the best ways to ensure that it remains truly effective?
Absolutely. I think part of that is ensuring that PB projects are designed to give residents true decision-making power and include an amount of public funds that the communities find meaningful to them to have impact, and that's going to differ based on where you are in a locality. At the same time, going back to the idea of managing expectations for residents and participants, I think that ensures that the process remains transparent, inclusive, and meaningful. And it needs staff and resourcing, right? So city officials are not stressed too thin. And as we were talking about, I agree with you on the communications campaigns before, during, and after the pre-B process to share information and improve transparency.
So one of the things I've noticed is a lot of times these are done under a mayoral purview. Not every single one. New York City's was under the council for a long time, but now it's under the mayor. And it seems to me like such a big win for mayors, but so often I find that they don't talk very much about it. Like it's not necessarily a major priority for them, even though from my vantage point, it's usually one of the great bright spots of what's happening. Why do you think mayors should care about PB?
That's a great question. I think when designed well, PB can deliver concrete wins for an administration on the community. Thinking of three things in particular. One is solving meaningful problems in people's lives. The second is an effective allocation of public funds that really taps into people's hyper-local expertise and knowledge. And the third is strengthening relationships between officials and community leaders, breaking down some of that us versus them dynamics and building trust and connective tissue that ideally can pay dividends in the future.
Absolutely. That's one of the things that we're thinking about a lot here in Denver is like, we want, I know the mayor loves it. I was lucky to speak to him about it briefly. But still, I think people like you and I who spend our time kind of steeped in it just see that it's like, no, there's so much potential here. I want you to see just how much potential there is, and that's a work in progress, but that's a goal we have. Do you see any risks if cities don't adopt deeper participation like PB?
It's a really good question. I think there's a challenge where you're stuck in a cycle of policy interventions that communities don't feel like are responsive to them, and you're not tapping into that local insights, input, and lived experience from community members. It can be an untapped resource to not really create a structure that channels people's hyper-local knowledge and lived experiences into the policy process, because it can, again, when designed well, increase trust, legitimacy in these processes. And these are things that so many electeds and mayors are really craving in this environment. And people also, I think, want to be a part of the process, and they want to put their creative energies to use. And so you're kind of not matching almost that supply and demand in a way.
It's true. Yeah, it's kind of a stranded resource, and what you were calling hyperlocal expertise or knowledge. Like, yeah, it's just sort of sitting there on the vine, not being plucked. Yeah. We did a process in Atlanta on a particular park called Candler Park, And it was just so interesting to see the specific ideas that people wanted, like specific statues or like painting electrical boxes or even something like weed abatement, which hadn't even occurred to us as something that which people were passionate about, but it won. It was one of the winning projects. And as I'm seeing this really like high fidelity set of project proposals come in, it just occurred to me, I was like, there's no way that somebody who works for the parks department who perhaps doesn't live near this park or doesn't utilize this park, and even if they do live near the park and maybe utilize the park, they can't have the level of knowledge that people that 1,000 people who have contact with it can have, and so you really do see that. So I envision a day in the U.S. when every city does participatory budgeting. I think it's very possible. It's just part of their normal resident engagement. How probable do you think this is? And what do you think we'd have to overcome to get there?
It's a great question. I think the biggest question right now is sort of the resource shortages that people are facing. How do we show that PB is a really good use of people's dollars inside the government? And I think it is. But I think we have to maybe do a little bit more on the de-risking side and then also on the kind of pooling resources and assets. So training efforts aimed at supporting city officials, broader public education, and maybe just more creative resourcing models. So it's not looked at like a zero sum, like you're funding a PB process instead of something else, but it's actually additive to you to fund a PB process to your other goals that you are trying to achieve.
That dovetails into a question I had around funding too. Because that's often something that you run into as a challenge for funding. It's the opening conversation. We have to have some funds that are liberated for this.
Yes.
What kind of models do you see there that work? How do you think we kind of overcome that challenge?
It's a great question. Look, I think when you look at the majority of PB that has been done in the US around capital dollars, there's a reason that things that are sort of physical, brick and mortar, are ripe for PB because they're tangible and you can see them, you can touch them. So I think that makes a lot of sense. I think processes like the one in Paris where it's really institutionalized and it's really tightly wound to a citizen assembly and it's part of an infrastructure for engaging people are, I think, a really powerful model because then it gets it out of the one-off, ad hoc, will we or won't we. I think part of it is when you have to, there's startup costs with these initiatives. And so when you have to build them from scratch, that takes more time and resources than kind of saying this is just the way we do business. So there is a little bit in this space writ large, a chicken and egg dilemma. How do you sort of fund some of these innovations? And then people say there's not enough data to show they work, but then you can't get the funding to show the data. So I think, and that's why I really applaud the work that you're doing and so many others in the field to try to innovate, de-risk, show bright spots, tell what's working, because I think we've already made a lot of progress in the last 10, 15 years. And I think it is within the realm of the possible that we see more institutionalized participatory structures in the United States.
In the realm of the possible, absolutely. I think it will happen. But there is this need for the dam to break somehow, right? Because it's like it works, but you're right. We're stuck in this kind of chicken and egg problem. But every city I've done it in, and when I speak to people, even in cities I haven't done it in, the demand is so high. Like every resident sees it as a no-brainer.
Yeah.
They're just like, this is what the government. Really, the way they describe to me is this is what they should be doing. Like, why aren't they asking me what we want? Right? Like, why isn't that something they were doing already? Why do we, And so you're like, that's how you know you have a fit, right? When everybody just sees it as completely logical.
Totally.
What promising experiments or ideas are you watching that could complement or evolve PB?
It's a great question, and we touched a little bit on that. I think a lot of it is around sort of a couple of things. One is revitalizing hyper-local community civic hubs, the work that the Trust for Civic Life is investing in, democratic experiments that are very complementary to PB, such as citizen assemblies or civic assemblies. Some of them are leveraging sortition. Fort Collins just had a really powerful example in Colorado of leveraging a citizen assembly, and then the recommendations from the citizen assembly were put on the ballot, and then they were actually reaffirmed through the ballot process, showing alignment between the assembly results and the views of the people. There's been really important climate assemblies happening. There's all sorts of really interesting, innovative models, and I do think there is a lot of potential to unlock digital platforms and digital tools to really do much more rapid engagement at scale, and think about also how to bring people together for transformative, deliberative experiences where they really feel seen and heard.
Yeah, the Citizens Assembly thing just keeps coming to me. I was actually in New York a couple days ago at a MetaGov Christmas party, and I met a fellow named Forrest Sparks who runs a thing called the Assembly Project. I don't know if you've come across him.
Totally. Yeah, Forrest is great. Yeah, and they're doing great work.
Excellent. Yeah, so him and I are going to speak, and maybe he'll come on the podcast at some point. So I was great.
He would be great.
I was happy to meet with him because I heard that New York just did that, just added a Citizens Assembly to their PB. And so that just keeps, crossing my path.
I think they're very complementary in a way, and I think that they really can be mutually reinforcing each other of sort of here's what more robust participation in civic life can look like.
Okay, so wrapping up here soon. So your career's had a great focus on pushing local democracy forward. When you look back at your career, what would you hope would be the impact, like at the end of it, what would you hope would be the impact on civic engagement?
That's very generous. I think for me, I want people to feel inspired. I want them to feel efficacious. Civic life can be fun, it can be joyful, it could be creative. We can all be a part of building a future where people see themselves in it, they feel a part of it, and can really build the kind of inclusive society that people want to be a part of.
Okay, and then last question here. So can you finish this sentence? It starts with, cities that lead the way in civic engagement will be cities that
deliver for their constituents and strengthen local democracy.
Love it. Thank you very much for being with me on my first interview for the Civic Trust Podcast, Holly. It's always an honor.
Thank you so much, Matt. This has been such a privilege, and I'm really grateful for all your support and all the work you're doing. Thank you for everything.